The static crackled through the operations center like electricity before a storm. Colonel Marcus Hartwell had seen 30 years of combat, from the deserts of Iraq to the mountains of Afghanistan, but the radar signature climbing out of the valley defied everything he knew about aviation physics. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, call sign Reaper 7, had just pulled out of a 90-degree dive at terminal velocity, black smoke trailing from both engines, hydraulics screaming failure codes across every monitor in the room. "Sir, that's impossible," whispered Lieutenant Torres, his voice barely audible above the humming electronics. The young radar operator's hands trembled as he adjusted his headset, watching the green blip on his screen climb steadily through 12,000 feet. The aircraft should have been scattered across the Afghan mountainside in 1,000 burning pieces. Hartwell's weathered fingers gripped the radio handset so tightly his knuckles went white. 3 decades of military service had taught him that impossible was just another word for something he hadn't seen yet. But this challenged the very laws of aerodynamics. The A-10's maximum dive speed was well documented, its structural limitations carved in stone by engineers and written in blood by test pilots who had pushed too far. "Reaper 7, this is tower control. Report your status immediately." His voice carried the authority of rank, but underneath lurked something he rarely allowed himself to feel: genuine concern. The pilot flying that Warthog wasn't just another number on his roster. Major Kestrel Vance had earned her reputation the hard way, through skill and determination that had silenced every doubter who questioned whether a woman belonged in the cockpit of America's most feared close air support aircraft. The radio remained silent for 17 seconds. In the operations center, 17 seconds felt like 17 hours. Every technician, every officer, every enlisted soldier held their breath, waiting for either confirmation of life or the hollow tone that would signal another hero's final transmission. Then, cutting through the static like a blade through silk, came a voice that carried the unmistakable calm of someone who had just danced with death and lived to tell about it. "Tower control, Reaper 7. Aircraft is flyable, repeat, aircraft is flyable. Requesting immediate landing clearance and emergency vehicles on standby." But there was something else in that voice, something that made Hartwell's blood run cold. It wasn't fear or panic. It was the sound of someone who had seen something down in that valley, something that had forced her into that impossible dive, something that would change everything they thought they knew about the enemy they were fighting. The war in Afghanistan was about to take a turn that none of them could have imagined, and Major Kestrel Vance was bringing the proof home in a damaged A-10 that shouldn't have been able to fly. The emergency vehicles were already racing toward the runway when Hartwell realized he was holding his breath. Whatever Vance had discovered down there, whatever had forced her into that death dive, was about to reshape their entire understanding of the conflict. The Taliban didn't have surface-to-air missiles capable of forcing an A-10 into such desperate evasive maneuvers. At least, that's what intelligence had told them. Intelligence, Hartwell was beginning to suspect, might have been wrong about a lot of things. Major Kestrel Vance had always been different from the other pilots in the 355th Fighter Wing. While her male counterparts strutted through the officers' club with practiced swagger, she moved through the base with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to lose. Her call sign hadn't been chosen ironically. Kestrel was a bird of prey, small but lethal, capable of hovering motionless before striking with devastating precision. She'd earned her wings at a time when the military was still adjusting to women in combat roles, when every mistake was magnified, and every success had to be twice as impressive to earn half the recognition. The A-10 community was particularly resistant to change. The Warthog was a warrior's aircraft, built for one purpose: destroying enemy armor and supporting ground troops in the most hostile environments imaginable. It demanded respect, and it gave that respect grudgingly. Vance had clawed her way through flight training, weapons school, and 2 previous deployments, accumulating flight hours and combat missions that would make seasoned veterans nod with approval. But approval and acceptance were different things entirely. In the ready room, conversations often grew quiet when she entered. Not from hostility. The men respected her skills too much for that, but from the peculiar discomfort that came with having their assumptions challenged by someone who refused to fit neatly into their preconceived categories. The irony wasn't lost on her. She flew an aircraft nicknamed the Warthog, an ugly, ungainly machine that nobody expected much from until the shooting started. Like her, the A-10 had to prove itself every single day, had to demonstrate that beneath an unassuming exterior lay something far more dangerous than appearances suggested. Now, as she fought to keep the wounded aircraft stable, hydraulic fluid spraying across her canopy like arterial blood, Vance reflected on the strange parallels between herself and the machine that might well become her coffin. Both had been underestimated. Both had survived things that should have killed them, and both were about to land carrying secrets that would change how their superiors viewed not just their capabilities, but their value. The base appeared on the horizon, a cluster of temporary buildings and permanent scars on the Afghan landscape. Home, of a sort. The kind of home that came with sandbags and razor wire, where the coffee was always bitter and the shower water was never quite warm enough. But it was safety, and after what she'd seen in the valley, safety felt like the most precious commodity in the world. Her hands moved across the controls with practiced efficiency, compensating for the damaged flight systems, nursing the wounded bird toward the runway. The A-10 might look like a flying tank, but it required a delicate touch to coax maximum performance from its twin turbofan engines. Today, with hydraulics failing and warning lights painting her instrument panel in Christmas colors, that delicate touch was all that stood between her and a very permanent landing. The radio crackled again. Reaper 7, you are cleared for emergency landing, runway 27. Emergency vehicles are standing by. Wind is calm, visibility unlimited. The air traffic controller's voice was professionally neutral, but Vance could hear the tension underneath. Everyone on base knew that aircraft returning from the valley rarely came back undamaged. Roger Tower Control, Reaper 7 on final approach. What they didn't know, what she was about to tell them, was that this time the damage hadn't come from the Taliban. Colonel Hartwell watched through the operations center's reinforced windows as the A-10 lined up for its approach. Even from a distance, he could see the damage. Smoke still trailed from the left engine, and the aircraft's normally rock-steady flight profile wavered slightly, indicating control problems. But it was flying, and that was more than anyone had expected after watching the radar signature of that impossible dive. "Sir," Lieutenant Torres called from his station, his voice tight with concentration. "I've been reviewing the radar data from Major Vance's mission. The dive profile doesn't match any known evasive maneuver. The angle was too steep, the speed too high. According to every flight manual we have, that aircraft should have broken apart from structural stress alone." Hartwell nodded grimly. He'd been thinking the same thing. The A-10 was tough, legendarily so, but it wasn't magic. Every aircraft had its limitations, and those limitations were usually discovered by pilots who pushed too far and paid the ultimate price. The fact that Vance had survived suggested either incredible skill, incredible luck, or something else entirely. "What about enemy activity in the area?" Hartwell asked, not taking his eyes off the approaching aircraft. "Any surface-to-air missile launches, anti-aircraft artillery?" "Negative, sir. No electromagnetic signatures consistent with SAM systems. No radar contacts except for friendly aircraft. Whatever forced Major Vance into that dive, it wasn't conventional anti-aircraft fire." That was what Hartwell had been afraid of hearing. In his experience, when the conventional explanations didn't fit, the truth was usually something far worse than anyone had imagined. The Taliban were resourceful and increasingly well-equipped, but they didn't have weapons capable of forcing an A-10 into such desperate evasive action without leaving some trace on the electronic warfare systems. The Warthog touched down hard, harder than regulation allowed but well within the aircraft's robust design parameters. Smoke billowed from the brakes as Vance brought the damaged aircraft to a stop. Emergency vehicles swarmed the runway like ants around spilled honey, their red lights painting the concrete in urgent colors. From the operations center, Hartwell could see Vance going through her post-flight checklist with methodical precision, even as firefighters sprayed flame-retardant foam around the smoking engine. That was typical of her, never letting urgency override proper procedures, never allowing emotion to compromise professionalism. It was one of the reasons she'd earned the grudging respect of her peers, and one of the reasons Hartwell knew that whatever she'd seen down in that valley would be reported with devastating accuracy. The canopy opened, and Vance climbed out with the careful movements of someone who had just survived something that should have been unsurvivable. Even from a distance, Hartwell could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she paused for just a moment at the top of the ladder, looking back at the valley where she'd nearly died. Whatever was waiting for them in her debrief, Hartwell knew it was going to change everything. Major Kestrel Vance's flight suit was soaked with sweat, hydraulic fluid, and something that might have been fear. As she climbed down from the A-10's cockpit, her legs felt unsteady, not from physical exhaustion, but from the weight of what she'd witnessed in the valley. The ground crew swarmed around her aircraft like concerned relatives around a wounded family member, their practiced hands already assessing the damage, cataloging the repairs that would be needed to get Reaper 7 airworthy again. "Ma'am, are you injured?" The voice belonged to Staff Sergeant Ramirez, the crew chief who'd been maintaining her aircraft since she'd arrived at Bagram 6 months ago. His concern was genuine, professional, tinged with the particular worry that came from sending someone you cared about into harm's way and getting them back in pieces. "I'm fine, Sergeant," Vance replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "But we need to download the gun camera footage immediately, priority 1, and I need to speak with Colonel Hartwell as soon as possible." Ramirez nodded, already reaching for his radio. In the A-10 community, gun camera footage was sacred. It was proof, documentation, the final word on what had happened when the shooting started. But there was something in Vance's tone that suggested this footage would be different, more important and more terrifying than the usual combat documentation. "Major Vance," called another voice, this one carrying the unmistakable authority of senior leadership. Colonel Hartwell approached with the measured stride of someone accustomed to being in charge, but his eyes held a concern that went beyond simple operational interest. "Are you all right?" "Physically, yes, sir. Mentally," Vance paused, looking back at her aircraft. The A-10's armored cockpit had saved her life, but it had also been her prison during the most terrifying 15 minutes of her military career. "Sir, we need to talk. What I saw down there, it changes everything." Hartwell studied her face, reading the signs that 30 years of military service had taught him to recognize. This wasn't combat fatigue or adrenaline crash. This was the look of someone who had seen something that challenged their fundamental understanding of the world. He'd worn that expression himself, years ago, after his first encounter with improvised explosive devices that seemed to defy the laws of physics. "Debrief in 20 minutes, he said finally. "Get yourself cleaned up, get some water, and meet me in the secure briefing room. And Major, whatever you saw down there, you did the right thing by bringing it home." As Vance walked toward the operations building, her reflection caught in the windows of the parked aircraft around her. She looked older than she had that morning, aged by more than just the few hours since takeoff. Her call sign had always been a source of quiet pride. Kestrels were hunters, precise and patient, capable of hovering motionless before striking with deadly accuracy. But now she wondered if her hunting days were over, if what she'd discovered in the valley had transformed her from predator to prey. The shower in the pilot's quarters was lukewarm and barely adequate, but it washed away the physical remnants of her brush with death. The mental remnants would take longer to process. As the water ran down her face, mixing with tears she hadn't realized she was shedding, Vance tried to make sense of what she'd witnessed. The official reports would call it enemy action, equipment malfunction, pilot error, anything except the truth. Because the truth was impossible to accept, even though she'd seen it with her own eyes and recorded it on gun camera footage that would soon be classified at levels that ensured very few people would ever see it. The truth was that humanity's technological superiority in Afghanistan, their advantage in air power, surveillance, and precision weapons, might not be as absolute as everyone believed. The truth was that something had been hunting her in that valley, something that moved with impossible speed and precision, something that had forced her into a dive that should have killed her, but had somehow, miraculously, failed to claim her life. The truth was that the war was about to change in ways that none of them were prepared for. 20 minutes later, Major Kestrel Vance sat across from Colonel Hartwell in a windowless briefing room deep within the operations complex. The walls were lined with maps, satellite imagery, and the accumulated detritus of a war that had been going on longer than most people cared to remember. A single overhead light cast harsh shadows across their faces, and the ever-present hum of air conditioning provided a background soundtrack to secrets that would soon be classified beyond the reach of normal military personnel. "Before we begin," Hartwell said, his voice carrying the weight of command decision, "I want you to know that this conversation is being recorded and that the contents will be classified at the highest levels. Whatever you tell me will be shared with people who make decisions far above both our pay grades. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" Vance nodded. She'd expected as much. In her experience, the more impossible something seemed, the more likely it was to disappear into classified files that would never see daylight. But disappearing into files didn't make it untrue, and it certainly didn't make it go away. "Sir, at approximately 13:47 hours, while conducting close air support operations in Grid Square November Kilo 4726, I encountered what I can only describe as an unidentified aerial phenomenon." The words felt strange in her mouth, too clinical for what she'd experienced, too sanitized for the terror that had driven her into that death dive. Hartwell's expression didn't change, but she saw his hands tighten slightly on the folder in front of him. "Describe this phenomenon, Major." "It moved unlike anything I've seen before. No visible means of propulsion, no heat signature on infrared, no radar return. But it was there, sir. It engaged me directly, forcing evasive maneuvers that pushed my aircraft beyond design specifications." Vance's voice remained steady, professional, but underneath lay a current of something that might have been awe or might have been fear. "Gun camera footage. Downloaded and ready for review, sir. But Colonel, the footage shows things that I'm not sure anyone will believe. Movement patterns that violate basic principles of aerodynamics. Acceleration rates that would generate G-forces capable of killing any human pilot." She paused, meeting his eyes directly. "And intelligence that suggests whatever was out there wasn't just reacting to my presence, it was studying me." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Hartwell had been preparing for a conventional after-action report, perhaps dealing with new Taliban tactics or equipment. He hadn't been prepared for something that sounded like science fiction delivered by one of his most reliable pilots. "Major, you understand the implications of what you're suggesting?" "Yes, sir. I understand that it sounds impossible. I understand that it challenges everything we think we know about aerial combat and enemy capabilities. But, sir, I also understand what I saw, and I understand that if I'm right, we're not just fighting the Taliban anymore." Hartwell reached for the secure phone that would connect him directly to higher headquarters. Whatever Major Vance had brought back from the valley was about to become someone else's problem, someone with more stars on their collar and access to classified programs that officially didn't exist. But as he lifted the handset, he wondered if there was anyone in the chain of command, prepared to hear what Vance was about to tell them. The gun camera footage played on a loop in the darkened briefing room, casting flickering shadows across the faces of the assembled officers. What they were watching defied explanation, defied belief, and defied everything they had been trained to understand about aerial combat. The timestamp in the corner of the screen read 13:47:23, and for the next 4 minutes and 17 seconds, Major Kestrel Vance's aircraft-mounted camera had recorded something that would soon be classified beyond the reach of conventional military analysis. General Patricia Hawthorne had flown down from Kabul specifically to view this footage. As the theater's deputy commander for operations, she'd seen everything the war had to offer. Improvised explosive devices that seemed to think, Taliban fighters who appeared and disappeared like ghosts, and intelligence reports that painted pictures of an enemy far more sophisticated than public perception suggested. But this was different. "Play it again," she commanded, her voice cutting through the tension in the room like a blade through silk. The footage began its third loop, showing Major Vance's A-10 conducting what appeared to be routine close air support when something entered the frame from the left side of the screen. It moved with fluid grace that seemed to mock the laws of physics. No visible wings, no exhaust signature, no discernible means of propulsion. It approached Vance's aircraft with what could only be described as curiosity, matching her speed and altitude with effortless precision. Then, as if reaching some kind of decision, it accelerated at a rate that should have been impossible, forcing Vance into the defensive maneuvers that had nearly killed her. "Major Vance," General Hawthorne said without taking her eyes off the screen, "talk me through your decision-making process during this encounter." Vance stood at attention, her voice steady despite the surreal nature of the briefing. "Ma'am, initial contact occurred during routine patrol operations. The object appeared on my left side without any radar warning or visual acquisition prior to its arrival. Its movement patterns suggested intelligence and intent rather than random atmospheric phenomena." "Intelligence and intent," Hawthorne repeated, finally turning to look at the pilot whose steady nerves had brought them this impossible evidence. "Explain." "Ma'am, it matched my flight parameters precisely: speed, altitude, heading. When I altered course to test its behavior, it compensated immediately, maintaining perfect formation. This continued for approximately 90 seconds before it began what can only be described as aggressive maneuvering designed to force me into defensive action." Colonel Hartwell spoke up from his position at the back of the room. "General, the dive Major Vance executed to evade this contact exceeded the A-10's published safety parameters by a significant margin. The fact that the aircraft remained intact suggests either extraordinary pilot skill or extraordinary luck. Or," General Hawthorne said quietly, "extraordinary intervention by whatever was out there with her." The room fell silent. In 30 years of military service, Hawthorne had learned to trust her instincts, and her instincts were telling her that they were looking at something that would reshape their understanding of the conflict in Afghanistan. More than that, it would reshape their understanding of humanity's place in a universe that might not be as empty as they'd assumed. "Major, did this object make any attempt to communicate with you? Any electronic signals, visual displays, anything that might suggest attempted contact?" Vance hesitated for a moment, and in that hesitation, Hawthorne read volumes. "Ma'am, there was no conventional communication attempt. However, during the encounter, I experienced what I can only describe as a sense of being observed, studied. It's difficult to quantify, but the object's behavior suggested intelligence gathering rather than simple curiosity or hostility." "Intelligence gathering." Hawthorne turned back to the screen, where the footage continued its endless loop. "Show me the point where it disengaged." The video advanced to timestamp 13:51:17, showing Vance's A-10 in its terminal dive, engines screaming, the ground rushing up with fatal inevitability. The object had followed her down, matching her impossible descent angle, staying with her as she plummeted toward what should have been certain death. Then, at the moment when physics should have claimed both aircraft, something remarkable happened. The object moved ahead of Vance's A-10, positioning itself directly in her flight path. For a fraction of a second, the camera captured what looked like some kind of energy discharge, a brief pulse of light that seemed to surround both aircraft. When the light faded, Vance was pulling out of the dive, and the object was gone. "It helped me," Vance said quietly, her voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. "I don't know how, and I don't know why, but it helped me recover from a dive that should have killed me. The G-forces alone should have rendered me unconscious, but I remained alert throughout the entire maneuver. My aircraft should have broken apart, but instead, it held together in ways that violate everything I know about structural engineering." General Hawthorne stared at the frozen image on the screen, at the brief moment when something impossible had intervened to save the life of an American pilot. The implications were staggering, terrifying, and wonderful all at once. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said finally, "we are no longer fighting a conventional war." The classified briefing broke up 90 minutes later, leaving behind a room full of senior officers who would spend the next several hours trying to process what they had witnessed. General Hawthorne remained behind with Colonel Hartwell and Major Vance, the three of them united by shared knowledge that would set them apart from the rest of the military for the remainder of their careers. "Major Vance," the general said, her tone shifting from official to personal, "you understand that what happened out there makes you invaluable to future operations. You've had direct contact with something that represents either the greatest threat or the greatest opportunity our species has ever encountered." Vance nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure which possibility frightened her more. "Yes, ma'am, I understand." "Good, because you're about to become the military's foremost expert on aerial phenomena that don't officially exist. Your flying days aren't over, Major. They're just beginning to get interesting." Outside the briefing room, the war continued its familiar rhythm. Helicopters lifted off for medical evacuations, cargo planes brought in supplies and mail from home, and young soldiers counted days on short timer calendars that decorated their bunks. But for those who had witnessed the footage from Grid Square November Kilo 4726, the war had fundamentally changed. They were no longer alone in the skis over Afghanistan, and they were no longer the most advanced aerial predators in the theater. Something else was out there, something that could move without visible means of propulsion, and think in ways that suggested intelligence far beyond human comprehension. Whether that something represented salvation or damnation remained to be seen. What was certain was that Major Kestrel Vance, the pilot who had been underestimated, overlooked, and grudgingly accepted by her peers, had become the most important aviator in the entire theater of operations. Her encounter with the impossible had transformed her from just another A-10 driver into humanity's first point of contact with something that would change everything. As she walked across the base that night, looking up at stars that no longer seemed quite as distant as they had that morning, Vance wondered if she was ready for the responsibility that had been thrust upon her. The weight of first contact, the burden of bridging the gap between two species, the terrifying prospect of future encounters that might not end as benevolently as her first. The kestrel, she reflected, was a bird of prey that could hover motionless while hunting. But what happened when the prey turned out to be hunting back? 3 days passed before the next contact. Major Vance had spent those 72 hours in a strange limbo, simultaneously the most important and most isolated person on the base. Her security clearance had been elevated to levels that prohibited casual conversation with her former squadron mates, and her mission assignments had been transferred to a classified program that officially didn't exist within the normal chain of command. She found herself assigned to a new unit, the 4477th Test Squadron, a designation that appeared on no organizational charts and drew personnel from across the Air Force's most classified programs. Her new commanding officer was Colonel James Mitchell, a soft-spoken fighter pilot whose career had been spent in the shadowy world of special access programs and compartmented intelligence. "Major Vance," Colonel Mitchell said as they walked across the flight line toward a hangar that hadn't been there the previous week. "What I'm about to show you represents 50 years of preparation for something we hoped would never happen and simultaneously prayed would happen every single day." The hangar doors opened to reveal aircraft that belonged in science fiction rather than military reality. Sleek, angular fighters that seemed to bend light around their surfaces sat alongside more conventional military aircraft that had been modified with equipment she couldn't begin to identify. Technicians in civilian clothing moved between the machines with the careful precision of people working with technology that could kill them if mishandled. "Welcome to Project Blue Sky," Mitchell continued, his voice carrying the weight of secrets that had been kept for decades. "Everything you see here exists because people like you, pilots who have encountered things that don't officially exist, have been bringing home evidence that couldn't be ignored." Vance stared at the assembled aircraft, trying to process what she was seeing. "Sir, how long has this been going on?" "The project, since 1947. Encounters like yours, since human beings first figured out how to get off the ground and stay there. But Major, what makes your case special is that this time they saved you. In 50 years of documented contact, that's never happened before." The implications hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't the first pilot to encounter something impossible in the skis. She was simply the first to survive the encounter with help from whatever she'd encountered. The first to be deliberately saved rather than merely studied. "Your mission," Mitchell continued, leading her toward an aircraft that looked like someone had redesigned the A-10 using principles from a more advanced civilization, "is to make contact again. To learn everything you can about their capabilities, their intentions, and their technology. And Major, to determine whether humanity has gained an ally or whether we're facing a threat unlike anything we've ever imagined." The modified A-10 bore her call sign on the nose, Reaper 7, but everything else about the aircraft had been transformed. The skin seemed to shimmer with an oily iridescence that reminded her uncomfortably of the object she'd encountered. The weapons systems had been replaced with sensor arrays that looked more like works of art than military hardware. "She's been built specifically for you," Mitchell explained, "using technology we've recovered and reverse-engineered over the past 5 decades. Some of it we understand, most of it we don't, but all of it has been designed with one purpose: to help you survive your next encounter and come home with answers." As Vance climbed into the cockpit of her new aircraft, she felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders. Every pilot who had encountered something impossible and died trying to understand it, every researcher who had spent decades analyzing evidence that couldn't be shared with the outside world, every military leader who had made decisions based on threats that officially didn't exist, they had all led to this moment. The instruments in the cockpit looked familiar but felt different under her hands, as if they were responding to her thoughts as much as her physical inputs. The displays showed information in ways that seemed almost intuitive, presenting complex data in formats that her mind could process without conscious effort. "The aircraft will teach you as you fly," Mitchell said through the comm system. "Don't fight it, trust it. And Major, trust yourself. You survived your first encounter because you made the right decisions under impossible circumstances. That's why you're here. That's why you're the right person for this mission." As the modified A-10 lifted off from the classified runway, Vance felt herself leaving behind everything familiar and heading towards something that would either represent humanity's greatest achievement or its final chapter. The sky above Afghanistan had become a frontier more vast and dangerous than anything explorers had ever faced, and she was about to become its first pioneer. Behind her, the base fell away, its lights growing dim against the vast darkness of the Central Asian night. Ahead lay the valley where her life had changed forever, where something had chosen to save rather than destroy, and where answers waited that would reshape humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. The modified A-10 responded to her thoughts with an eagerness that should have been frightening, but instead felt natural, as if the aircraft had been waiting for her specifically, designed not just for her mission but for her mind. As she flew toward her second encounter with the impossible, Major Kestrel Vance wondered if she was still human, or if her first contact had begun a transformation that would change her as fundamentally as it was about to change the world. The valley appeared unchanged in the infrared display, a landscape of shadows and thermal gradients that revealed nothing of the secrets it had shared 3 days earlier. But as Major Vance descended through 15,000 feet, every sensor on her modified A-10 began registering anomalies that would have been invisible to conventional aircraft. Electromagnetic disturbances that rippled across frequencies that shouldn't have existed, gravitational fluctuations that made her stomach lurch in ways that had nothing to do with turbulence, and something that the technical manual euphemistically called temporal displacement indicators. Blue sky control, Reaper 7 approaching contact coordinates, she reported, her voice steady despite the surreal nature of the mission. Speaking to controllers who existed in classified facilities hidden within ordinary military bases, flying an aircraft that incorporated technology humanity was only beginning to understand, hunting something that challenged every assumption about intelligence and physics. Copy, Reaper 7. All sensors are nominal. Remember, this is a reconnaissance mission. Observe, record, learn. Do not engage unless directly threatened. Colonel Mitchell's voice carried the authority of command, but also the concern of someone who understood that they were operating beyond the boundaries of conventional military doctrine. The valley floor rushed past beneath her, limestone cliffs and scattered vegetation that looked exactly like 1,000 other valleys in Afghanistan. But the instruments told a different story. Thermal imaging showed heat signatures that moved with purpose rather than the random patterns of wildlife. Electromagnetic sensors detected organized patterns that suggested technology rather than natural phenomena. And something deep in her mind, something that hadn't been there before her first encounter, whispered that she was being watched. "Contact," she announced, her voice cutting through the static that had begun to build on all communication frequencies. "Bearing 270, distance approximately 4 miles. Object is matching my course and speed." On the main display, the contact appeared as a shimmer of distorted air, visible only because the modified sensors were designed to detect things that normal eyes couldn't see. It moved alongside her aircraft with the same fluid grace she remembered from their first encounter, but this time there was something different about its behavior. Less aggressive, more curious, almost welcoming. Reaper 7 were showing multiple contacts now. Count 4, no, 6 objects. They appear to be surrounding your aircraft at a distance of 2 to 3 miles. Vance felt her heart rate accelerate, but not from fear, from excitement, from the dawning realization that this wasn't an ambush or a test of strength. It was a formal introduction, conducted by beings who understood that first impressions mattered when two species encountered each other across the vast gulf of space and time. "Control, they're moving into formation with me. Standard diamond pattern, maintaining precise positioning, attempting communication on all frequencies." For several minutes, only static answered her efforts. Then, gradually, patterns began to emerge from the electronic noise. Mathematical sequences that built upon each other with elegant complexity. Prime numbers, followed by the Fibonacci sequence, then more advanced concepts that pushed the boundaries of her mathematical knowledge. It was the universal language of intelligence, the first tentative words in a conversation between civilizations. "Control, I'm receiving structured mathematical communication. They're starting with basics and building complexity. It's beautiful." Through the modified displays, she could see her escorts more clearly now. They weren't machines in any sense that human technology would recognize. They seemed to be composed of organized energy, matter and force unified in ways that suggested mastery of physics far beyond human achievement. But there was something about their movement patterns, something about the way they responded to her aircraft's position, that suggested personality, individuality, consciousness. The mathematical dialogue continued, growing more sophisticated as both sides demonstrated their understanding of increasingly complex concepts. Physics, chemistry, astronomy, the fundamental building blocks of scientific understanding shared across species and star systems. But underneath the mathematics, Vance sensed something else. Emotion, perhaps, curiosity definitely, and something that might have been relief. Control, I don't think they're here to conquer or destroy. I think they're here because they're lonely. The words surprised her as much as they surprised Colonel Mitchell, but as soon as she spoke them, she knew they were true. These beings, whatever they were, wherever they had come from, had been watching humanity struggle toward technological maturity for decades, waiting for the moment when contact could be made without causing panic or cultural collapse. They had saved her during their first encounter not because they needed her specifically, but because they needed humanity to be ready for what came next. Reaper 7, we're reading massive energy buildups from all contacts. Recommend immediate evasive action. But Vance felt no threat from the beings surrounding her aircraft. Instead, she felt invitation, opportunity, the chance to be part of something larger than warfare and nationalism, and the petty conflicts that had defined human history. The energy buildups weren't weapons charging. They were doorways opening, pathways to understanding that would transform not just military doctrine, but humanity's entire conception of its place in the universe. Control, I'm going to accept their invitation. Whatever happens next, make sure the world knows that we were offered a choice, and we chose to reach out rather than strike first. The light that surrounded her aircraft was warm, welcoming, and filled with possibilities that stretched beyond the horizon of human imagination. The sensation of movement without traveling, of being everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, lasted exactly 17 seconds according to the mission chronometer. When the light faded and conventional physics reasserted their authority over Major Vance's modified A-10, she found herself in a place that challenged everything she understood about geography, architecture, and the fundamental nature of reality itself. She was still in her cockpit, still breathing the